Zara Whitmore stormed through the airport terminal, her designer heels clicking against the polished floors like a ticking bomb. She was going to miss her flight. Her private car had been stuck in traffic for over an hour, and now, as she reached the gate, the airline attendant gave her a sympathetic but firm shake of her head. "I'm sorry, miss." "Whitmore, but the flight to Chicago has already departed," the woman said, her tone polite but unwavering. Zara clenched her jaw. "That's unacceptable. I need to be in Chicago by morning for a meeting that could change my company's future. Get me another flight, any flight." The attendant tapped at her keyboard, then winced. "The next available flight is at 8 a.m. tomorrow." Zara exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of her nose. That was too late. She needed to be in Chicago before sunrise. Private jet. She muttered, mostly to herself. "Weather conditions have grounded most private flights tonight," the attendant added, as if reading her mind. Zara resisted the urge to curse. This was a nightmare. "Excuse me, madam," a deep voice interrupted. "I couldn't help overhearing. If you need to get to Chicago tonight, I can drive you." She turned, eyes narrowing as she took in the man standing before her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and ruggedly handsome in a way that was entirely unfamiliar to her usual world of polished, tailored businessmen. His navy Henley clung to his strong frame, and his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead, giving him an effortlessly charming look. But what caught her attention most were his eyes, warm brown, steady, and sincere. "And you are?" she asked, arching a skeptical brow. "Ronan Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "I'm heading to Chicago anyway. I drive long-haul routes for a living. Figured I'd offer." Zara hesitated. She didn't take rides from strangers. She didn't take risks. But she was out of options, and something about him, the steady confidence, the way he didn't seem the least bit fazed by her sharp tone, made her pause. "You're seriously offering to drive me overnight?" she asked. He shrugged. "It's a straight shot. If we leave now, we should get there before dawn." Zara glanced at her watch, then at the flight board. She had no other choice. "Fine," she said finally, "but if you try anything," Ronan chuckled. "Relax, lady. I'm just a guy trying to make an extra buck." Something told her he was more than just that, but she ignored the thought. 20 minutes later, she was in the passenger seat of his truck, her suitcase tucked in the back, the city lights disappearing behind them. Silence stretched between them for the first half hour. Zara was used to sleek, luxurious cars with tinted windows and temperature-controlled seats, not the slightly worn but surprisingly comfortable interior of Ronan's truck. The scent of leather and faint traces of coffee filled the air. "So," he said eventually, breaking the silence, "what's so important in Chicago that you're willing to take a 12-hour drive with a stranger?" Zara sighed, crossing her arms. "A deal. A merger that could take my company global." "Your company?" He glanced at her, eyebrows raised. "You're the CEO." Surprised, she asked, tilting her chin up slightly. "A little. Most CEOs I've met don't usually take overnight road trips with guys like me." She frowned. "And what exactly does that mean?" He smirked, eyes back on the road. "It means you're probably used to first-class flights and five-star hotels. This is a little different, huh?" Zara huffed. "You have no idea." Ronan chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, buckle up, princess. This is going to be a long night." And somehow, despite everything, Zara found herself smiling. Zara shifted in her seat, glancing at the faint reflection of herself in the window. The highway stretched endlessly before them, illuminated only by the occasional glow of passing streetlights. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet, this kind of stillness. Her world was constant movement, boardrooms, negotiations, flights scheduled down to the second. Yet here she was, in the passenger seat of a stranger's truck, miles away from the life she meticulously controlled. Ronan adjusted the radio dial, landing on a station playing soft rock. It was a stark contrast to the classical music or dead silence she usually preferred while working. Yet she didn't mind it. "You don't seem like the kind of person who takes detours," Ronan said, his eyes never leaving the road. Zara exhaled, resting her elbow against the window. I'm not. This wasn't exactly part of the plan. Bet you don't like when things don't go according to plan. There was amusement in his tone, but not mockery. That obvious. A little. Silence settled between them again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The hum of the engine filled the space as she watched the empty road ahead. You do this often? She asked after a while. Pick up strangers in need of a ride. Not usually, but you looked desperate and I figured I'd help you out. She glanced at him, studying the sharp angles of his face, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel steady, sure. There was something about him that felt solid. Why are you driving to Chicago? She asked. His jaw tightened slightly. Work. She raised an eyebrow at the clipped response. You don't seem like the trucker type. He let out a low chuckle. And you don't seem like the kind of CEO who talks to guys like me. Something about the way he said it made her pause. There was no bitterness in his voice, just an observation, and he wasn't wrong. She didn't usually engage in small talk with anyone outside her corporate sphere, but something about Ronan made her want to know more. What did you do before this? She asked. He was quiet for a moment before answering. Construction, owned a small company for a while. What happened? He flexed his fingers slightly against the wheel. Life. She recognized a closed door when she saw one. He wasn't going to elaborate, and for once, she didn't press. Instead, she leaned her head back against the seat, letting her eyes drift shut. The rhythmic hum of the truck, the soft music, and the steady presence of Ronan beside her was oddly soothing. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she felt the vehicle slow. She opened her eyes just as Ronan pulled into a gas station. Stretch your legs if you need to, he said, turning off the engine. Zara stepped out, the night air crisp against her skin. She glanced around. Fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a pale glow over the nearly empty parking lot. Ronan walked around to the pump, pulling out his wallet. She noticed the slight hesitation before he swiped his card. She wasn't sure why, but something about that moment stuck with her. The way his shoulders tensed ever so slightly, the way he exhaled before continuing as if nothing had happened. When he walked back, she spoke without thinking. I'll cover the gas. His head snapped up. I got it. You don't have to, he shook his head. I don't take charity. It's not charity, she countered. It's a business expense. You're technically transporting a CEO to a high-stakes meeting. His lips twitched. Nice try. She crossed her arms. So you're just going to refuse free money? Pretty much. She didn't know whether to be annoyed or impressed. They got back in the truck, and as Ronan pulled onto the highway, Zara found herself studying him again. He was a mystery, a man who didn't seem to fit into any of the categories she was used to. You have a family? She asked, surprising herself with the question. His grip on the wheel tightened slightly. Yeah, a daughter. Something in his voice shifted softer but with an underlying weight. How old? 6. She glanced at him, catching the way his expression softened just a fraction. It was the first real glimpse of vulnerability she'd seen. What's her name? Ava. Zara nodded, turning her gaze back to the window. She didn't ask anything else, but for the first time that night, she felt like she understood a piece of him. They drove in silence for a while, but it wasn't the tense kind. It was the kind that settled deep in the bones, where words weren't needed. And for the first time in a long time, Zara didn't feel the need to fill the silence. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the dark ribbon of asphalt illuminated only by the truck's headlights. The hum of the engine filled the space between them, steady and constant. Zara found herself watching Ronan out of the corner of her eye, noticing things she hadn't before. The way his fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel when he was lost in thought. The slight furrow in his brow when he focused. The way his jaw tightened when something weighed on his mind. She wasn't sure why she cared. Maybe it was because he was unlike anyone she'd ever met. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, she wasn't surrounded by people who only cared about her title, her power, or what she could do for them. Ronan didn't seem the least bit fazed by the fact that she was one of the most influential businesswomen in the country. He treated her like an ordinary person. And for some reason, that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "You're staring," Ronan said, his voice laced with amusement as he glanced at her. Zara straightened, shifting her gaze to the window. "I am not. You were," she exhaled, shaking her head. "You must be exhausted if you're imagining things." Ronan chuckled, low and smooth. "Right, imagining." Heat crept up her neck, and she quickly changed the subject. "How much longer?" "Few more hours." She nodded, watching as the landscape outside shifted from endless open fields to the occasional cluster of buildings. It was too late for most towns to be alive with activity, but she caught glimpses of neon signs flickering in the darkness. A 24-hour diner, a rundown gas station. A lone convenience store with a single car parked out front. "You hungry?" Ronan asked, as if reading her mind. "No," his eyes flicked toward her. "When's the last time you ate?" She hesitated. Between the chaos of the airport, the stress of missing her flight, and the rush to find a way to Chicago, she hadn't even thought about food. Ronan let out a knowing sound. "That's what I thought." Before she could protest, he was pulling into the parking lot of a roadside diner. The neon sign buzzed weakly, casting a dull glow over the cracked pavement. It was the kind of place she would never have stepped foot in under normal circumstances. Yet here she was. They stepped inside, the scent of coffee and fried food instantly filling the air. A tired-looking waitress barely glanced up from behind the counter, nodding toward an empty booth. Ronan slid into one side of the booth, and Zara hesitated before sitting across from him. The vinyl seat was worn, the table slightly sticky despite being wiped down. She resisted the urge to pull out her phone to check emails, to immerse herself in the world she knew best. But something about this moment felt different. The waitress shuffled over, pen poised above her notepad. "What'll it be?" Ronan didn't even look at the menu. "Burger, fries, coffee." Zara hesitated before sighing. "Same." The waitress nodded and walked away. Ronan rested his forearms on the table, studying her. "Bet this isn't your usual dinner spot." She met his gaze, unflinching. "You'd win that bet." He grinned, not mocking, just amused. "Let me guess. Fancy restaurants with impossible reservations. Tiny portions on oversized plates." Zara smirked. "Something like that. Bet they don't serve fries like this." She glanced at the counter, where a plate of fries sat beneath a heat lamp, glistening with oil and salt. "No, they do not." Ronan leaned back, stretching his arm along the back of the booth. "You ever get tired of it?" She frowned. "Of what?" "The polished, picture-perfect life." Zara opened her mouth to argue, to say that she loved her life, that she had built it from the ground up with her own blood, sweat, and sacrifice. But the words didn't come. Ronan watched her, something unreadable in his gaze. "Didn't think so." The waitress returned, setting their plates down with a dull thunk. Zara stared at the greasy burger in front of her, then at Ronan, who was already taking a bite like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. She hesitated for only a second before picking hers up. The first bite was messy, sauce dripping onto the wax paper lining the plate. It was nothing like the elegant meals she was used to. And yet, it was the best thing she'd had in a long time. Ronan grinned. "Told you." She rolled her eyes but took another bite. For the next 20 minutes, they ate in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging brief comments about the food, the diner, the odd characters sitting at the counter. It was easy, uncomplicated. When they finished, Ronan slid a few bills onto the table before Zara could reach for her wallet. She arched a brow. "I could have paid for that. I know. Then why didn't you let me?" "Because sometimes you just let people do things for you." She didn't have a response to that. Back on the road, the air between them felt different, lighter, more charged. Zara leaned her head against the window, exhaustion creeping in. The tension in her shoulders had eased, the constant buzz of stress that usually lived beneath her skin, quieter than it had been in years. She wasn't sure when she drifted off, but the next thing she knew, the truck was slowing down. "We're here," Ronan said softly. Zara blinked, straightening. The Chicago skyline loomed ahead, the city lights glittering against the pre-dawn sky. Her heart clenched unexpectedly. She should have felt relieved. But instead, there was a strange, unfamiliar ache in her chest, because this meant the journey was over, and she wasn't sure she was ready for that. The towering skyline of Chicago gleamed through the windshield, a stark contrast to the quiet highways they'd traveled through the night. Zara had spent years mastering the art of arriving composed, unreadable, untouchable. But as Ronan pulled up to the grand entrance of her hotel, a strange weight settled in her chest. The valet attendant approached the truck, eyeing it skeptically before his gaze landed on Zara. His posture straightened, recognition flashing in his eyes. "Miss Whitmore, we've been expecting you." Zara barely heard him. Her fingers curled in her lap, the warmth of the night's journey fading as reality came crashing back. The hotel's gold-plated doors shimmered under the early morning sun, a symbol of everything she had built, everything she had fought for. And yet, none of it felt as significant as the man sitting beside her. She turned to Ronan. He rested his hands on the wheel, his expression unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes, something she wasn't sure she was ready to name. "This is you," he said, his voice steady but quieter than before. She swallowed, hesitating. "Yeah," a pause, the kind that stretched too long, filled with things unsaid. "I should go," she added, though the words felt wrong in her mouth. Ronan nodded. "Yeah," but neither of them moved. The valet cleared his throat, shifting awkwardly. Zara barely heard him. This wasn't supposed to happen. She had been so sure this would end the moment they reached Chicago. That she'd step out of the truck, walk into her world, and forget the way Ronan made her feel like something more than just a name on a Forbes list. But now, faced with the reality of leaving, she wasn't sure she could. Zara. Her name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. She met his gaze and saw it the same hesitation, the same ache pressing against his ribs. She had spent her life making calculated decisions. This wasn't one of them. Before she could overthink it, she leaned in. The space between them collapsed in an instant, her lips brushing against his in a kiss that was both uncertain and desperate. Ronan inhaled sharply, startled, but his reaction lasted only a second before his hand moved to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, as if they were both memorizing the moment, afraid it would slip through their fingers the second they let go. The sound of a car door opening nearby jolted them apart. Ronan's hand lingered against her skin before he let it drop. She exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. She started, but she didn't know what to say. Ronan's gaze searched hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, with a hint of a smile, he said, "Go close your deal, Whitmore." It was her out, the perfect escape, but she didn't want to take it, and that terrified her. Forcing herself to move, she grabbed her bag and stepped out. The valet reached for the door, but before he could close it, she turned back. Ronan was still watching her, like he wasn't sure if this was the last time he'd see her. She wasn't sure either. And then, before she could second-guess herself, she said the only thing she knew for certain. "Don't go too far." His lips parted slightly, surprise flashing across his face. Then, after a beat, he nodded. She turned and walked through the hotel doors, her pulse hammering. She didn't look back, but she didn't need to. Because she knew, without a doubt, that he was still watching, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to leave something behind. She wanted to go back. Zara stepped into the grand hotel lobby, the polished marble floor gleaming beneath the chandelier's soft glow. The weight of the night settled onto her shoulders, but it wasn't exhaustion that made her hesitate. It was something far more unsettling. She should have felt relief. She had made it to Chicago in time. The meeting that could define the future of her company was only hours away. Everything was on track, and yet her mind wasn't on the boardroom waiting for her. It was in the truck she had just left behind. Ronan. His name sat heavy in her chest, the way his hand had lingered against her skin. The way his gaze had stayed on her even as she walked through the hotel doors. The way she had asked him not to go too far. That had been reckless. Zara Whitmore was not reckless. She didn't make impulsive decisions, didn't take unnecessary risks. She didn't kiss men she barely knew in parking lots of roadside diners, and yet she had, and she didn't regret it. A discreet cough pulled her from her thoughts. Her assistant, Lillian, stood a few feet away, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp. She was dressed impeccably, as always, a tablet in hand, already prepared for whatever Zara needed. "Your suite is ready," Lillian said. "I took the liberty of rescheduling your prep session for the meeting. You have exactly 3 hours to rest before the team arrives." Zara nodded, forcing herself to focus. "Thank you, Lillian." "Anything pressing?" "Just a few details regarding the merger. I sent everything to your email." Zara exhaled, pushing back thoughts of Ronan. "Good, I'll look it over." Lillian hesitated for half a second before speaking again. "Your driver called, by the way. The one who was supposed to pick you up from the airport. He was concerned when he couldn't get in touch with you." Zara stiffened slightly. "I found another way here." Lillian's eyes flickered with curiosity, but she didn't press. "Understood. Let me know if you need anything else." With that, she disappeared down the hall, leaving Zara alone with her thoughts. She made her way to the penthouse suite, stepping inside the lavish space. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline. Everything was pristine, tailored to perfection. Exactly the way she liked it, and yet it felt empty. Zara moved to the window, staring out at the city below. Somewhere out there, Ronan was probably already back on the road, driving to wherever his next job took him. Maybe she should have asked more questions. Maybe she should have told him to wait, but what would that have changed? Their worlds were too different. She was a CEO, a woman who thrived in the corporate battlefield. He was a man who had left something behind, a man who carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. And yet, when she had kissed him, none of that had mattered. Frustrated with herself, Zara turned away from the window. She needed to focus. The meeting was too important to let herself be distracted. She sat down, pulling up the documents Lillian had sent. But the words blurred together, unreadable, as her mind drifted back to the warmth of Ronan's touch. 3 hours later, Zara walked into the sleek conference room, her team already assembled. The merger deal was at stake, and every decision she made from this point forward would determine the future of her company. The negotiations were intense. The other executives were sharp, pushing back on key points, testing her resolve. But Zara held her ground, her voice steady, her arguments airtight. She had built her empire from nothing, and she wasn't about to let anyone undermine her. By the time the final papers were signed, exhaustion threatened to drag her under, but she didn't let it show. She shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and exuded the confidence they expected from her. And yet, as she stepped out of the boardroom, the first thing she did was reach for her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation creeping in. She didn't do this. She didn't chase after things, not deals, not people, but Ronan wasn't just anyone. And she wasn't sure she was ready to let him become just another passing moment. Before she could overthink it, she made her decision. She called him. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Didn't think I'd hear from you again." Ronan's voice came through the line, low and steady. Zara exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "Neither did I." A pause. Then quieter, "How'd the meeting go?" "It's done. The deal is signed." "That's good." Another silence, this one heavier. Then finally, she said what had been pressing against her chest since the moment she walked away. "Where are you?" Ronan didn't answer immediately. Then, with a hint of something unreadable in his voice, he said, "Still in Chicago." Her breath caught. She hadn't expected that. "Thought you'd be back on the road by now," she admitted. "So did I." Her grip tightened around the phone. "Zara," he said, her name laced with something she couldn't quite define, "tell me what you want." She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the sound of his voice, steady and waiting. Then she answered, "Stay." The word was soft, barely above a whisper, but it was enough. She could hear the way his breath shifted on the other end. "Where?" he asked after a beat. She swallowed. "Meet me at the rooftop lounge, 1 hour." A pause, then, "I'll be there." The line went dead, but Zara didn't move for a long moment. She had no idea what she was doing. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't care. She just knew that she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Not yet. The rooftop lounge was quiet, the city stretching out beneath Zara in a sea of glittering lights. A few patrons milled about, lost in quiet conversation, but she barely noticed them. Her eyes were fixed on the entrance, anticipation threading through her veins. She had never done this before, never waited for a man like this, never allowed herself to step into the unknown without a carefully laid out plan. Yet here she was, heart pounding, waiting for Ronan. And then the door opened. He stepped inside, the glow from the lanterns casting shadows across his face. His presence filled the space effortlessly. His posture relaxed, but his gaze locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Wordlessly, he made his way to her, settling into the seat across from hers. "You actually came," she murmured, her fingers tracing the rim of her untouched glass. "You told me to stay," he said simply. "So I did." A breath she hadn't realized she was holding escaped her lips. "How was your meeting?" He asked, leaning back slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "It went well," she admitted, "better than I expected." "Good." The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with something unspoken. "Why did you stay?" she finally asked, meeting his gaze head-on. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because I wasn't ready to leave." Her pulse fluttered. "And now?" His lips parted slightly, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "That depends on you." Zara had spent her entire life making decisions based on logic, on strategy, on what would bring her the most success. But this wasn't about business. This was about something that had no clear path, no guaranteed outcome, and for the first time, that didn't scare her. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "I don't want this to end." Something shifted in his expression, something raw, unguarded. "Then it doesn't have to." A breeze rolled across the rooftop, but Zara barely felt it. All she could feel was the warmth of his touch, the steady presence of the man who had walked into her life unexpectedly, and somehow made her question everything she thought she knew about herself. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers with hers. "I don't know what this is, Zara, but I know I don't want to walk away from it." Neither did she. For once, she wasn't thinking about the future, about the risks, about what made the most sense. She was thinking about the way he had looked at her in the truck, the way he had kissed her like she was something worth staying for. "I don't either," she admitted softly, "but I want to find out." Ronan's grip tightened ever so slightly. "Then let's find out." The noise of the city faded, the world narrowing to just the two of them. And for the first time in a long time, Zara Whitmore let herself follow something other than logic. She followed her heart, and it led her straight to him. The following weeks blurred into something entirely new, something Zara had never allowed herself to experience before. Ronan stayed in Chicago. He found temporary work, something flexible enough to give them time together without uprooting his life completely. And Zara, for the first time, let herself shift priorities. They explored the city together, late-night diners, hidden jazz clubs, early morning walks before the rest of the world woke up. It was a different kind of life, one that existed beyond boardrooms and business deals, and she loved it. She loved the way Ronan could make her laugh with just a look, the way he challenged her without ever making her feel like she had to prove herself. She loved the way he listened, truly listened, without trying to fix or control. And more than anything, she loved the way he looked at her. Like she was more than the CEO, more than the polished, put-together woman the world expected. Like she was just Zara. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she arrived at her penthouse to find Ronan waiting for her. "You're early," she said, setting down her bag. "Had a feeling you'd need a break," he replied, handing her a glass of wine. She smiled, taking a sip. "You're not wrong." He sat beside her on the couch, his arm draping casually across the back. "You've been running at full speed since you got back from New York last week. When's the last time you did something for yourself?" "This," she said, nudging him with her shoulder. "You," his expression softened. "That's a dangerous answer, Whitmore." "Why?" "Because I'm not going anywhere." The words settled in her chest, warm and steady, and she believed him. Months passed, and what started as something uncertain turned into something undeniable. Ronan moved to Chicago permanently, finding work that gave him the stability he needed while still allowing him the freedom he craved. Zara learned to let go, to carve out time for something beyond her career. Together, they built something neither of them had expected, something real. And one evening, as they stood on the rooftop overlooking the city, Ronan pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You know," he murmured, "I never expected to meet someone like you." She smiled, resting her hand against his chest. "And I never expected to let someone like you in." He tilted her chin up, his gaze steady. "No regrets. None." His lips brushed against hers, slow and deliberate. And as the city lights flickered around them, Zara knew this was the best decision she had ever made. Love wasn't something she had planned for. But sometimes, the best things in life weren't planned at all, and she wouldn't change a single thing.